Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute present The Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter. If you like us, please help us by subscribing and by reviewing us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might listen. And don't forget to sign up for weekly updates and study questions at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.
Welcome back to the Formed Book Club. We're continuing our discussion of Father Robert McTeigue's Real Philosophy for Real People, Tools for Truthful Living. We've been going through it rather carefully because it's densely written, not dense in the sense of incomprehensible, but dense in the sense of rich and thought-provoking. Do either of you wish to begin, or should I begin?
Well, I'm going to begin with the epigraphs at the beginning of the chapter. So I don't imagine it was going to be earlier than that. Now, I like the fact that Father McTeigue obviously begins with two literary epigraphs there. The famous one from Alexander Pope, "Know then thyself, presume not God to scan, the proper study of mankind is man," which is sort of often given as a succinct definition of humanism. Alexander Pope's position was somewhat more complex than that, and then he has this wonderful quote, which I won't read, but from Hamlet, what a piece of work a man is, how noble, etc., etc. And then it leads into one of these wonderful anecdotes that I just find delightful. And can I read that? Because I think it's funny and entertaining as much as anything else.
Sure.
So, having given those two epigraphs, he then begins in the chapter proper, and he says, "The following is an accurate account of a conversation I had with a student. Student, I'm convinced that there is no significant difference between a human person and any other kind of animal, and I wanted you to be the first to know. Me, I'm not convinced that you're convinced. Student, huh?" That's the best line. "Me, I'm not convinced that you're convinced that there is no significant difference between a human person and any other kind of animal, because you're talking with me and not a squirrel. Not only that, you wanted me to be the first to know. What difference would it make whom you told first if there were no difference between one animal and another?"
Okay. And right below that on page 144, as is his wont, he defines what he's going to be covering. There are some questions we simply cannot afford to get wrong, and among them is, what is a human? Philosophical anthropology is an attempt to offer a systematic and coherent account of human nature. And then on page 146, he tells us how he's going to approach this. New paragraph there. Our treatment of anthropology will be in three parts. The first, we'll look at various reductionisms, physical and social. The second part, we'll look at dualism. The third, we'll offer an account of a human person as a composition of bodily and non-bodily elements. And again, what he's doing here, he's saying, there's various ideas of what it means to be a human being, a human person. And the two elements that come up in all of these conceptions of man are something physical, material, bodily, and something which is not physical, not material, non-bodily. And so how are these related? Well, some people reduce one to the other. We're just all body. Or others say, well, it's actually two, but they're separate. They don't really communicate. Dualism. Or there's some kind of a composition here, a composite reality. So again, he takes all the possible options and then analyzes them to show you which one simply won't work, and that leaves you with the one that does work.
And the reason for doing so is because we're, as you've pointed out many times, we're working through this wedding cake with metaphysics on the bottom and ethics on the top, and anthropology's right in the middle. So before you can talk about ethics, you have to first know what a human person is.
Yeah, I mean, you can't talk about humanism until you know what a human person is. I mean, anthropology is obviously the building block or the foundation upon which everything else is built.
So then jumping into the first of those three parts on page 149, he sums it up 2 lines down. Physical reductionism, like all reductionisms, makes use of what it rejects. Anthropological physical reductionism refers to non-physical realities, for example, truth, intention, to assert that there are no humanly relevant non-physical realities. So once again, he takes the reduction ad absurdum. So let's suppose that we're just material. Well, then what? And on page 148, he gives a little dialogue there about what a person says. He has intentions, he has desires, things he loves, things he doesn't love. Well, are those bodily or not? Then
and relating it back to the story of you might as well be talking to a squirrel, which Joseph read to us at the beginning. He finishes that paragraph, Father, on 149 with, if anthropological physical reductionism were true, there would literally be no one to have a conversation about its being true.
No, that's right. So that's physical reductionism. He also talks about social reductionism, and he sums that up on page 152 at the bottom of the section there. Social reductionism requires, even as it rejects, a private person to wear the public masks that social reductionists say constitute human persons. So if you say we're just all the roles, there's nothing inside. It's all roles we play. But who's the we? Who's actually playing the role? So you can't reduce persons to the roles they play. That's another. He makes quick work of this. I mean, for each of these, principles that he's enunciating here, you could read books on them. But I think he certainly gives a way to start.
Right.
I think that's the glory of this book, is for those of us that aren't trained philosophers and probably will never be trained philosophers, it's a wonderful introduction to, and then a wonderful overview of the whole subject, that's why this book is valuable.
Yes, and then not quoting something, I will just kind of summarize here. When he talks about his mentor, the philosopher Paul Weiss, saying that in order to have any kind of moral theory or practice, there are three relationships you have to have: responsibility, attributability, and accountability. For any action that takes place, you got to be able to say, well, I did it. I'm the one who am the subject of that activity. But you also have to have others able to say, no, he did it. He can attribute it to me. And finally, the accountability. Why did you do it? And that goes into three phases. Why did I do it? Well, the explanation of why, the reason, and then whether that makes it blamable or praisable, whether we should blame the action or praise the action. I've been very abstract there.
If I can come in maybe with one of my practical examples that Father McTeigue gives anecdotally, again, top of page 161. In the classroom, students in the front row become my props to illustrate philosophical points. And rule number 1, don't sit in the front row of one of the Father McTeigue's classrooms. To illustrate responsibility, I take a swipe at a student and say, suppose I whacked George here in the forehead. What would you think if, after doing so, I looked at my hand and said, I wonder why the atoms of that hand did that? Why would the atoms of that hand want to hit George? The students chuckle and see my point. I continue, no, I hit George. I made a private, inwardly initiated choice as a moral agent to use my hand to strike him in order to express my deeply held conviction that hats should not be worn in the classroom. So again, you were abstract, and this is an example of Father McTeigue being concrete as well as abstract.
Right, and we even have a personal, anecdotal experience of this, don't we, Father? When we were having pizza once with my kids, and one of my sons knocked over a glass of some table. And Father said, "Hey, why'd you do that?" And my son said, "My watch did it."
Yes.
So kids do try.
They do their best. They do their best.
They do their best to evade responsibility, but we're all adults here, and we need to own up to what we do.
I think, well, either that or start wearing a watch, one or the other, Vivian.
The other, and this was actually, I kind of misspoke before, the real principles from his mentor, Paul Weiss, were the distinction between private, which is interior, and public, that was exterior, and most importantly, permeability, that they are connected. And I'm not sure, are we ready for his graph yet? Does that come later?
This is I missed. Is it which one?
Well,
is this the one on page 165? You mean that one?
The beer glass, yes, the beer glass.
Yeah. That's not a beer glass, Father. If that was a beer glass, it'd fall over and spill the beer all over you. It's got a round bottom.
I'm sorry.
If that was a beer glass, you'd spill your beer. It's got a round bottom.
Let's back up a step because we were talking over. You were talking over each other.
I know. Sorry about that.
Joseph, would you repeat what you said, please?
All that I said was that's not a beer glass, Father, because it's got a round bottom, and if you had your beer in that, you'd spill it on yourself.
Well, the point is you have to keep drinking it. You can't set it down.
Just don't put it down, right?
That's a McTeigue beer glass. So, and Vivian, you were saying?
Yes, that before as he's introducing this illustration, I love this line on page 162, where he says, "I'm always more than just my body, but my body is where you can begin to find me." Yes. I love that line.
Yeah.
And what he's trying to illustrate with this drawing of the beer glass or beaker or whatever it is on page 165, see that little sliver of it at the top? That's the body. That's where you begin to find me. But there's a whole interior life to a person.
Vivian, we'd like to hold that. We'd like to hold up to the camera so that people can actually see it, because it's obviously what visual image we're talking about here.
There it is.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
And so just that tiny sliver at the top is the body that you see of the person. And this whole other part of the graphic, the larger part of it, is the inner person, the private dimension of the person. And that is where all the important parts of the person are. And so...
But he will, on some page, he puts all caps here, where he makes it clear that the fundamental principle here, it's on page 159, in the middle of the page, where he says, all caps, the public and private dimensions of an actuality are permeable. When he says actuality, he means that's Paul Weiss's word for a human being, not just any being, but a human being.
Right, and he's asserting that principle in order to counter dualism, which would separate these things and make them unable to communicate with each other. This is what he means by permeable, that these things are not separated by some sort of barrier, that they cannot interpenetrate each other. And then also by private, he means very specifically, the interior life of the person, that the body is simply the outward expression of, and that's what he means by public. So again, this was one of those things where I had to read this section very carefully, look at each of these terms, make sure I understood how he was using these terms. And it isn't difficult to do. You just might need to go a little more slowly and be patient with the material. It's not that it's so abstract it cannot be understood, but
I will issue this
time.
I will issue this warning to readers that if you go through it like you just described, Vivian, it becomes clearer and it becomes more persuasive. But
Yeah.
be careful, because these apparently somewhat abstract principles in these diagrams will lead to some very concrete conclusions that he brings about, for example, the proper use of one's sexuality.
Yes.
And if you start affirming these things that come before, you will be you'll be required to say, what he says about sex is right.
Right. And in fact, the thing that set up my understanding for that discussion, even more than this nifty graphic, was this breaking down of the different kinds of relationships we have with other actualities. This I, it, I, you, I, thou. What does he mean? Well, if you treat another person as an it, that's a diminishment. And then if you relate to that other person as an I, you, you're acknowledging that that person's more than an it, more than just a body. However, and now you're capable of wronging. You can't wrong a chair. I suppose you could use it improperly and, wrong it that way, but you wrong another person. But then taking it to this other level of betrayal of a person, now that's an even deeper relationship. Then I'm acknowledging you're another person, but now I'm a person I'm in relationship with and I betray you. That's another level. And that's why he has on this chart, this picture, this hierarchy. There's a hierarchy to these relationships that you need to acknowledge in order to really understand your actions and the impact that your actions have on other people.
Right, and it goes
brilliant.
Right, and it goes from the self, the noumenal, which is at the bottom of the graph, but it's at the top of the person in a certain sense.
Yes.
But it rises up and includes mood, temperament, desire for value, which is affectivity and emotions, and then further onto the social. These are all connected.
Can I say something here? This is
Please
just something
do.
I want clarification of, because it seems that all of this he has in the private dimension of the self, shall we say, are all emotional and non-rational. And I'd like to see somewhere in that the actual process of reason, which is obviously also part of who we are.
No, but that's why on the right side you'll see it at the bottom: noumenal, then affective, and then social. So noumenal is reason, nous, the mind. Then affective is emotions, and then social is interaction with others.
So at the bottom then that's deeper, because the hierarchy points upwards, which would suggest that noumenal, as in nous, reason is not as high in the hierarchy as our emotions or our social interactions, which I'm sorry, I'm probably just showing how inadequate ultimately a chart's going to be.
Yes,
it's not going to cover everything, but I do want, because it was confusing me, and I thought, well, I'll just raise it.
Yes.
No, that's good.
That's a really good question. And so let's see where he says.
Well, we should. That's it, right. Let's ask him about that when he's on the show at the end. But I would say,
well, here he explains it on the top of 169. He explains how he's using this word hierarchy. Hierarchy refers to a system wherein the elements are ordered by rank. How does this apply to the human privacy? And again, by privacy, he means the interior of the person. That which is closer to the public dimension is less essential to my identity as this particular unique human person. That which is closer. Oh, wait, is that a typo? Oh, that which is closer to the public's most easily changed. Yeah, I can get a nose job. All right. The deeper levels of the privacy give rise and govern the other layers. So you're right. That's confusing because the hierarchy would seem to imply.
Yeah. It's almost if the arrow should be going in the other direction.
Yes.
Fact, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Right, but it's partly a problem with English language. I mean, that we think hierarchy means you go from higher to lower, but higher in the word hierarchy, it means sacred or holy principles, you know. So it's the interior, the self, the noumenal, which is the most profound, and profound is deep, even though it's the highest, right?
Right.
And that moves you through lesser and lesser profound areas of the human psyche, affectivity.
Yes. In fact, in another place, he uses the word root. The deeper you go, you're going down to the roots.
Yes.
I'm glad you asked the question, Joseph, because it is.
Yeah, I think it's just the direction that the arrow of hierarchy is pointing, because it makes it look as if it gets more important as you get towards the surface, whereas in actual fact, he's saying the opposite.
Right.
Yes, that's exactly right, and that was good to point that out.
I would like to go back to page 167, a third of the way down. He's talking about emotivism, that is making decisions on the basis of one's emotions only. And according, he says, to ethical emotivism, if I say abortion is wrong, what I'm really saying is I don't like abortion, or I don't like how I feel when I think about abortion. Well, Joseph, does that remind you of anything from one of our favorite authors? I'll take you off the spot.
Thank you.
One of the books that everyone should have on his or her list of required reading is The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis. It's a very small book, only 120 pages long, but it's a profound book about what's happening in our culture, the way we look at ourselves and others, and especially this emotions as a basis for our judgments. And so he's criticizing a grammar book here by two authors. He calls them Gaius and Titius. Those are Latin names, which were used traditionally in courses on moral theology. You have Gaius and Titius. It's like, Bob and Ann is what you use for computer stuff. Anyway, he says, this is on page 14 of my edition of this. In their second chapter, Gaius and Titius quote the well-known story of Coleridge at the Waterfall. You remember, actually I didn't remember, but that there were two tourists present, that one called it sublime and the other pretty, and that Coleridge mentally endorsed the first judgment and rejected the second with disgust. Gaius and Titius comment as follows, quote, when the man said that is sublime, he appeared to be making a remark about the waterfall. Actually, he was not making a remark about the waterfall, but a remark about his own feelings. What he was saying was really, I have feelings associated in my mind with the word sublime, or I have sublime feelings. So that's exactly the ethical system used by a wide range of people, in which they claim, when they claim, you say, well, that's good. No, what you mean is you feel good when you see that or talk about that.
Yeah, subjectivism. Yeah. I would actually say that, this is not what Lewis is saying there, but when Coleridge is applauding the use of the word sublime, he's not using it in that subjectivist sense.
No, he's not.
Coleridge's poetry, the whole point is that this leads us beyond ourselves to something higher and deeper.
Right. Well, they're criticizing Coleridge, basically. They're
Right.
saying, yeah.
Father, when was Abolition of Man first published?
Oh, well, I don't know that offhand.
But it might be in the front matter, because obviously
45?
1947.
47, okay.
So this has been with us for some time, because what he's apart there is a textbook for young people.
That's right.
And taking it apart. And by the way, Hans Urs von Balthasar wrote the foreword to the German edition of that.
Really?
I did not know that. Huh.
Well, he was a great fan of C.S. Lewis.
He was a big fan of C.S. Lewis.
Yeah, I knew that. I just didn't know that he'd actually got as close, if you like, as putting pen to paper.
If there's any theologian of modern times who has more profoundly explored the depths of hell, so to speak, what is hell, and did Jesus experience it or not, it's Balthasar. And I remember him telling me personally up at this little place in Switzerland there, the Rigi Hüsli it's called. He told me, he said, C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce, is the greatest book on hell ever written. He said that. Now, it was self-deprecatory in a sense, because probably he's the one that's written best about this. But that was his judgment of Lewis's book, which is a short book, and I think of course it's hard to say one of his best, because all his books pretty much are floating at the very top of the rankings, it seems to me.
Yeah, just say one thing as well. Just as what I want to, the tangent, so to speak, is I always believed that Lewis was working on the abolition of man at the same time he was writing That Hideous Strength. And That Hideous Strength, I'm fairly sure, was published in 1945. So that 1947 date is something which puzzles and baffles me. And if I think about it, I'm going to look into it deeper.
Okay, very good. And then you'll write a book about it, which would be good. So, okay, the next, we've talked about reductionism, dualism, and combination anthropology. We've talked about private, public, and permeability. We've talked about responsibility, attributability, and accountability. We've talked about I did it, you did it, why. That's the same thing about responsibility, attributability, accountability. We've talked about the three relations of I, it, I, you, and I, thou. So that's a lot, all right? But now comes another tripartite reflection on sign, symbol, and sacrament. Again,
how long do we need on this? Because we're running out of time. We've got another 5 or 10 minutes, 5 minutes or 10 minutes we want to go over.
Why don't we finish sign, symbol, and sacrament, how he defines them, and then we can stop there, because there's plenty more after that on this chapter.
Okay.
Okay, on page 171, he says a sign is an indicator. So a sign points to something which is not itself. But he says a symbol is a kind of sign. Like a sign, it indicates, that is, it points to something not itself, but it also is much more than a sign, a kind of metaphor. It stands between the public and private dimensions. He gives the example of a wedding ring. That's a sign of a union, but it also embodies, in a sense, it incarnates that union. It's not
Father, if I may, you misread the word. You said metaphor, but what's written there is mediator.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're right.
And I wouldn't point it out if it weren't so important for
my fault.
You just said about the wedding ring.
All right. We won't airbrush that out of the recording here. We'll let that stand as a sign of one of my many mistakes.
Well, and I only pointed out just because the meaning of what he's saying here, that the symbol is a kind of mediator. Actually, I'd never really thought of a symbol in that way until I read that word. because I thought of symbols more as metaphors, actually, not actually as bridges or. So then it says on 172, down the end of the middle paragraph there's a continuity between the symbolized and the symbol, which is different from a mere sign.
Right, because the symbol actually participates in the reality. So, for example, if you lost your wedding ring, and I said, "Oh, I have one just like that. I can get for you," that wouldn't solve your problem. You want this wedding ring because this is the one he gave me. It's now different. It doesn't just signify our marriage; it embodies the relationship which that marriage is. And then, but then you say, well, what's a sacrament then? Because a sacrament is an outward sign of inward grace we see in theology. But he says on page 174, a sacrament is a kind of symbol. So symbol is a kind of sign, and a sacrament is a kind of symbol. Like other symbols, a sacramental symbol is a mediator between the symbolized and the reader of the symbol. The difference lies in the fact that a sacramental symbol is a symbol taken up in action. And of course, he can give the theological examples of that, of baptism. Water is a symbol, but it's poured over you. Bread and wine are a symbol of Christ's body and blood, but they become, through the action of the consecration, they become Christ's body and blood. So there's always an action that is related to a sacrament, which raises a symbol up into another level.
And there's another action going on, and that's your acceptance and reciprocal giving. So there's the action taking place
both directions.
In both directions in a sacrament. And so now, aren't you wondering, reading this, so what is this going to have to do now with just ethics simply, right? Where is he going with this? I sure was wondering how he was going to tie this all together.
Well, he summarizes it in page 176, and then we can maybe stop with that and then unpack it later. But about 5 lines down, he says, my contention is that the human body is the sacramental symbol of the human person. And people nod their heads and say, oh, that sounds right. Well, watch out, because that's going to lead to some conclusions and some consequences. Any final remarks or comments, anyone?
No, except that you want to just remind people of the next book when we eventually get there.
Sure, let's do that.
Well, our next book is going to be 8 Popes and the Crisis of Modernity by Russell Shaw. So be thinking about purchasing that in advance, because that will be the book we get to next.
Very good. Thanks, everyone. We hope to see you, hear you, or at least have you see us and hear us again at the Formed Book Club. God bless you.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Formed Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.